Our moderator today is Mr. Kenny Ting, Director of Asian Civilizations Museum and Peranakan Museum in Singapore, as well as Group Director of Museums National Heritage Board, Singapore. Can I please invite Mr. Kenny Ting, as well as all the speakers of today, to join us on the stage. Thank you.
Everyone's supposed to join me up here. Everyone just spoke today. Just sit wherever. I don't bite.
I have 3 mics for everyone to share.
Are we missing somebody? Okay. Oh, me. Thank you so much, Bruce, and welcome everybody again to Chat. May I start by first thanking Chin Chin and Mizuki again for the privilege and the honor of being invited to this forum and for moderating this wonderful panel. It is such a delight to be in this beautiful UNESCO-awarded building. I'm so jealous of your atrium and how the light comes in and casts shadows on the wall here. It's really a wonderful and splendid job. So I have to confess that I'm not a textile expert. I'm not a textile anything. I'm just a museum director. The only thing I have to do with textiles is that I really love batik. And so I have loads and loads of batik. And so I was listening very, very keenly to the presentations about batik. But if there's one takeaway that I got from today's sessions is that staging textiles is a challenge in 2 senses of the term. First of all, it's a challenge because you're always trying to figure out how best to sort of present something that is ostensibly 2-dimensional in a multi-dimensional format, whether it is to sort of bring out the stories and the people behind the making of the textiles, the complexity of the making of the textiles itself, and what these textiles actually mean. But it's also a challenge in terms of staging textiles being a sort of provocation. Because in bringing textiles to contemporary audiences, you're always finding ways to either draw out or invest new meaning in these works of art and of craft. And these meanings often have to do with contemporary day issues, whether it's gender, politics, culture, identity, uncomfortable histories, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me, in response to what Bruce said this morning about what the real theme of the conference today was, which is textile as concept, I like to think of sort of staging textiles as being a kind of uncanny subversion of the contemporary layman's conception of what a textile is. I mean, I'm a layman, so your average visitor who steps into the museum tends to think of textiles, the concept of textiles, as that sort of vague thing that sort of is what you put the color and the prints and motifs on, that then goes into making the clothes that they then wear. So the idea of textiles for the everyday person is buried under layers and layers and layers of other kinds of ideas and concepts that is often meaningless. And so, in effect, for us all in the museum to stage textiles is to completely subvert this hierarchy and to bring what is at the bottom and what may be actually quite forgotten or meaningless for the everyday visitor to the fore, to make textile not the medium, but actually the subject. And I think in this respect, we're all magicians. So I'm going to just sort of end off with that. And we have a board up back that has questions that the audience has proposed. And I've sort of taken a picture of it so I can sort of pick out some of the more salient questions that people have asked, as though this was an iPad. So there was one question I thought that would be very meaningful. It was actually posed to Reiko-san and Reiko and Satoshi. I thought, again, I must congratulate you because the exhibition is just mind-blowingly beautiful. It's nothing like I've ever seen, so congratulations again. So the question that was posed to Reiko, but actually I feel could be posed to everybody on this particular panel, and let's kick off with this question then, is what is your first memory of textiles? So maybe I'll ask Reiko-san to start, and then I'll also sort of ask the rest of the panelists to share a bit about this.
Thank you. Yeah, I already wrote on the board, like a wall. When I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, my family, a merchant from Kyoto always visited our like a house. And my grandfather, calling old lady, like auntie and mother and so on, and always like lots of boats of textile will be on the floor, and you can hear the sound of the textile, and you can see the color of the textile on the floor. So that was the first impression, and I never forgot that. なんだろうな、もうとにかくこう興奮する感じ。Excitement. そうそうそう。Yeah, yeah. Of the textile.
Me? Well, I'm also like outside of the textile industry, but since I started working with Reiko-san, somehow her work reminds me of my mom. Yeah, well, because I'm not saying like you're my mom, but you're like my mom. No. But my mom used to actually sew a lot, like including my shirts. Well, because I think she was learning a lot about like how she actually create the clothes for the kid, which my sister is still doing that. And that was my impression. Like, so she brought me to the fabric store, and then she asked me like which fabric I like. Yeah, so it's like the classic, but that was in my memory of the textile, my life.
I have to confess that I don't have any keen sensitivities about the textile. So I try to recall my first memory, but all the memories about the textiles all about the exhibition chat, unfortunately. So then, after working for these projects, I started to be aware of textile. So then my textile memories sometimes painful, and sometimes really exciting, and then sometimes really thrilled. But then I'm still running, and that is the joy, basically. Yeah.
In Java, I'm Japanese woman. So in Java, we grown up with batik. So every time I was ill as a child, my mother gave me apa itu selimut? Like a blanket. Yeah. And I always have the feeling that I will be okay again after that. So this always, we live always with this memory. So.
Okay. I remember a story of the first confrontation about the idea of women and men thinking about working with textile. That there was a discussion when I was about 8 between my father and my mother. That my mother told my father, I hate and I refuse to work with the sewing machine. So she never said, I cannot sew and I don't want to sew. So in our household, my father was always the one behind the singer machine, restoring our clothes. And maybe it had to do because he was also like a boat builder, and he was sewing the old tarpaulin to cover the wooden sailing boat. And I remember one day in the weekend when he was wearing his jeans. There was a big cut in his jeans, and I was playing with him, and I teared it off. And from that, I created my first jacket from this part of his jeans, trousers. And I sort of confiscated the Singer machine since then.
Let's see, I think very young. I remember standing in my crib. Wow. And I had a blanket, you know, a baby blanket, your favorite blanket that you have. And I remember sucking on a bottle and keeping time by rubbing my thumb on the corner of the blanket, eventually wearing it out. And then I guess the next time would be a dress, my kindergarten photo of a dress that my mother made. And then I would, of course, continue making my clothes through high school. So.
I guess one of my earliest memories was, I remember it dazzled my mind when I saw like one of my childhood best friends. She's Peranakan Chinese, so her grandmother used to wear this. Every Chinese New Year I go to for visitation, she would wear this pair of beaded slippers. So I used to think growing up that it's something that is so Peranakan that you see in Southeast Asia. And then when I joined the Peranakan Museum, which is part of the Asian Civilizations Museum 10 years ago, I started to unpack. The more I try to look at why it's uniquely Peranakan, the more I feel and discover that actually it's related to a lot of beading traditions around the world and embroidery traditions. So. For this exhibition, Kope, of course, I was really delighted to find out when talking to Kope that she was particularly also inspired by the beaded slippers that she saw in our collection, and we're trying to see maybe we'll work on something in the future, like trying to make it more popular again, because the idea of beadwork actually became in Southeast Asia much more. It's now slowly becoming more popular, but not, I think, what it was like, say, 50 years ago. So yeah, I just remember that, because when Kenny said, what was the first memory, it just like sparked in my mind, like because the beads are made of glass and they always catch the light with a sparkle.
It's very hard to summon a solid memory, and I don't think I could trust it because there is too much intellectual structure to it when I'm trying to do it. But I'm thinking that fabric and textile is a good medium for transmitting the memories. And now, since we're talking, there is a memory that is looming in my head, and it's my grandparents' house in Ukraine, when they had this kind of a bit of a grotesque carpet on the wall, you know, kind of patchworky with thick flowers. And then it migrated to my grandparents' house in south of Russia, still there. And funnily enough, it's not a haptic memory. It's more of a visual memory, because you could I could visualize the density and the thickness of the thread. But yeah, I think it's I wouldn't trust this as like the original memory of it.
So I hope the audience can see just how much textiles are embedded in memory and in tradition and in some ways in heritage, not just at a communal level, but at a personal level. But yet, at the same time, in all your presentations today, you essentially spoke about innovating in the space of actually presenting textiles, or even in the process of producing textiles in the case of Reiko-san. So this brings me to the next question, which I think is also very well asked from the audience. And it was actually just kind of 4 words, so I'm going to interpret these 4 words. It was preserve versus utilize, new tech versus old tech. So I guess I would interpret this question to mean, you know, in your particular practice, to what extent do you value innovation versus tradition? You know, what do you feel? Where do you stand in terms of this dichotomy between sort of the old and the new, or heritage versus the contemporary in the space of textiles? Is there even a dichotomy? Anyone, please. Anyone can start.
Well, I think it's, for me, in collecting for the museum, often, you know, we have a collection to build upon, but particularly with fashion, and I say fashion, but I come from a textile background, and even though it's fashion, the first thing I look at is textiles, but particularly I think with, in collecting contemporary fashion, or even, you know, some of the textiles that are being used, we often look and favor a lot of the designers that historicize, whether it's a silhouette or you know, taking a textile, an old textile, and riffing off of that. So for me, I think it's like tradition informs the future, and you know, and then when somebody like Reiko comes along, that kind of melds both. She does both the traditional and the super innovative. I think is really quite remarkable and something that is worthy of our collection.
For me, I think it's not always good to just utilize emerging technology or new technology. Well, my company is about the new technology, but in a way, I deny like some of the new technology. For example, like since I start working with Leico, I think to make or to find the better solution for the future is we have to look at the emerging technology, new technology, and then also we have to look at the old technology too. And then, so well, I actually asked a question to Leico about, like, for example, punch card. In terms of like my industry, like the digital industry, it's so easy to actually make it. Like, we can make the matrix, we can make the program, laser card, etc. Maybe like 2 days, 3 days, we can make the program so easy. But I was asking Leico-san about that, but there's one guy who is actually making the punch card traditional way. And well, if I, you know, invent the new program to actually make the punch card, I'm gonna steal his job. I'm gonna, you know, well, which is so fragile in the situation. So for me, well, especially the textile industry is really interesting, and then also like like stone balancing a balanced industry that still using old machines, like what we mentioned, like the Nissan or Toyota. For example, like one in what I filmed in a Tsuruoka, which is like they're still using a 9023 or 8 Nissan made the machines, and it's amazing. Just one motor, a control, maybe like hundreds of parts like moving at the same time, but they're still using it. Which means like, well, maybe they have financial issues, but also the industry or technology itself was already accomplished 100% back in the day. So that's why like they're still using the same machine, fixing it. So the textile industry is so interesting, and then also doesn't have any, like, I don't know, the gap to actually penetrate from the outside, like us. Of course, like Shimaseki invented the new weaving machines and etc., but it's totally different. So I was asking like Leico-san, why you don't use a machine like it's already like without using a punch card, just a, you know, automated machine. Well, but the gap between the strings is too tight, so that's why she preferred to use a handmade. So that balance is like so. I don't know. I don't have any answers, but I want to ask you the answer about what it should be shifted to the new technology, or should we find a better answer to combine like old technology, new technology together? Like, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, yeah. For me, the dichotomy between tradition and inventions or the high tech is not big things, big issues. Rather, why these traditions or why this technology that need to be served for what? That is more important because, in Japan, so we like to talk about the traditions, but sometimes tradition is just a conventional methodology or way of thinking. It's a kind of neglect embrace a new idea. So I think it's at this classifications. It doesn't matter.
I did a lot of interviews with batik producer on the north coast of Java, and it is so they produce batik Peranakan, and they always tell me that it is so traditional and classic motifs. So as I told you, these motifs, it is the tradition. But then I see that it was an innovation 100 years ago, but it became tradition. And they still produce new motifs, and it will be a tradition again. So it is always mixed, but they produce always with the hand batik, and it is like the old method. But yeah, it is always a change, and it is a transformation. So for me.
Yeah, I think it's always a cycle. And the one thing about the importance of keeping some of the traditional pieces in an art museum is that it's, as you kind of reinvent or improve weaving or anything like that, it changes the hand of the textile. If any of you have ever stroked a Renaissance Venetian silk velvet, it's like nothing else. And also 18th century Japanese silks for kimono is fluffy. It's like so light compared to a 19th century kimono silk. So I think that's one thing that's really interesting, that I do agree that it cycles and something traditional or something new becomes traditional, but each time I think it's important to keep the tactile and and in fact, when I first started as a curator, one of my mentors said, it's important for you to give the public a sense of how the textile feels, about the weight or whatever, because it's so tactile. It's the first thing that touches our body when we're born. It's the last thing to touch our body when we die, but it's really, and it contains all those memories that we have.
I think being trained as a historian, I really identify with what everybody is sharing now. I think really this dichotomy between tradition and invention, it's really, and something innovative is really, I think something that's really important to think about, in the sense that I believe, like in an art museum particularly, I think the use of the collection is the importance of historicizing everything, because a lot of things that we consider tradition today was actually innovative in its time. And so I guess I feel the role of the museum, therefore, is to observe. The curators have a need to observe very keenly when did this tradition appear, and then you collect, in a way, the representative inventions of its time, because before you know it, as Sharon was saying, it will be called tradition. And then as a museum, you therefore become that repository of those memories of that very strong inventions in that sense. I mean, I have to deal with this, I think, question quite often, because I still work on the collection of Peranakan textiles at the museum, and I often get the community coming to me and saying, oh, Jackie, you need to collect more because like the tradition is dying. And I often tell them that, oh, at the museum, we prefer to use the word changing rather than dying, because there are definitely the conservatives that still try to do it exactly the same way, but there are also people who continue to try to do it in different ways today. And I think, therefore, the role of the museum, rather than judging, is really to be very shrewd in collecting what is actually in the industry, how they're reacting to it, and what in a way become significant like moments to remember in this kind of textile tradition slash innovation.
Yeah, I think like tradition is something very fluid, and especially living in Indonesia, tradition is a living tradition. So it's not something from the past, but it's also something from the present and maybe from the future. So I think also now, especially young people are very aware of it as well, especially because of the decline of because of the globalization. Decline in the sense that values are shifting, and then they try to compare, say, how things are at the moment and from the past and where it can be in the future, be part of their life and enriches their lives. So for example, about this bar cloth, which is now with a women that I found who are still creating this bar cloth, they don't do it anymore to resist to anything. I mean, not resist to the local powers, but more related to the market values. So they create those sheets because somebody wants to buy them at the moment in Java or in Bali, or they get orders, you know. So it creates a new value for them to create it. So they continue the tradition, but of course it has a different meaning for their life nowadays. So yeah, I think we have many, many different interpretations related to this, what is our tradition and how somehow we see our lives related to that.
I showed Mela the collection of bath clothes at the West Museum Wien, and they are very old, maybe 150 years ago, and they are very beautiful. It is like a modern thing to wear. It is very beautiful, yeah? And then I'm happy that you make this artwork.
Thank you, Yanni.
I actually love how this particular conversation is going, you know, because what all of you are saying is that tradition, which is often seen as set in stone and fixed, it changes, it's fluid. You said it's fluid, this term. But at the same time, what you all are saying is also that innovation itself is not a new thing. Every generation, for millennia perhaps, there's always been innovation in how we produce and how we create. I will use this opportunity to sort of address one question that actually Bruce posed, which is thoughts on time as a medium. I assume that means sort of why, the reason for sort of juxtaposing the contemporary and the traditional in the presentation that, on Guopei that Jackie presented. I'm feeling a bit left out, so I'll answer that one. It's precisely because we were trying to make a point that at every, you know, in each millennia and every sort of generation or dynasty, there was innovation. How can you say that this sort of Ming dynasty Yongle bowl wasn't an innovation? At the time, it was something that was completely just brand new in terms of the use of materials, the use of motifs, in order for it to be sort of exported to the Middle East. So we just wanted to say that actually there is an innovation, there is a tradition of innovation that we were trying to present in this particular exhibition. I get to answer the question too. All right, on that note, I will open it to the audience. I have a few more questions from the board, but I thought I'd rather sort of like let people ask. Janice. Oh, we need a mic.
Thank you very much to everyone for their presentations. Yes, my question is really based around the title, which is called A Production Studio to Museum. And I observed, and it really is what the curators think about this question of staging, because partly it's a dialogue between different moments of history, whether it's the early Russian constructivists and a performance around Yoko Ono. But really, that moment where different journeys are established for the visitor, the audience, to maybe not take a path that they're usually used to following. So there may be something about labels. Sometimes they're very long or sometimes they're very short. But what have they learned from working with people outside of, or different disciplines, for example, media and architecture? Or I was particularly interested in the opera stage manager who came in and rethought how you might articulate a certain collection I think it happens in lots of fields, but I'm interested how curators respond to that in trying to draw in different constituencies, perhaps, who have a different expectation of the journey according to intergenerational debates as much as cultural diversity ones.
So I guess the question was on how curators sort of respond to quote-unquote sort of outsider views, so sort of like partners from various other sectors like opera or media or architecture even, coming in to sort of partner you in the putting together of an exhibition or in sort of a treating or interpreting a collection. Sharon?
I guess that's me. Regarding the fashioning fashion and dealing with a very well-known opera set designer and costumes, I mean, it was great that he was a costume designer too. And when we first showed him the collection, you know, he really got it. He understood it, he loved it, you know, and we thought he would do a great job. And his first design was really, I was so upset about that I went to my director and complained, because it was, he just was showing things flat, and all the way, there were no barriers or no interesting path from here to the back of that room. And when I first went to the director to complain about this, you know, Michael, who's very, never says a bad word about anybody or anything, you know, he thought a while, he says, well, you know, maybe he was thinking about, like when you're in the Tuileries Gardens, you look across and you see people in the distance, you know, and I said, that's not what this is about. We're in a museum. You know, we want people to see things close. So I think it was, you know, it wouldn't have been my first choice, but it did, people loved it. A lot of people loved it. The other trend that's happening in our museum or other museums, because all museum directors talk to each other, is sometimes bringing in artists, fine artists, to come in and work and interpret either a gallery space or the collection. That sometimes some curators get stuck, you know, in a more academic or kind of, you know, the days of doing catalog raisonnés is over. Your catalogs now have to be kind of part coffee table, beautiful book, and part, you know, informational. And so I think it's you know, I always try to keep an open mind, because an artist, a famous artist coming in to interpret a pre-Columbian collection, or, you know, that's normally kind of dead, or, you know, like as with the European art painting galleries that stay up forever, it animates it, and it brings, and I think, well, even if somebody who knows that famous artist and is coming to see his or her installation, reinstallation of a pre-Columbian ceramic exhibition, and they come in to see that artist, but then look at the pre-Columbian, look at the old pieces and get excited and learn something about it, then it's worth it, I think. You know, it's all about kind of expanding audiences. And we're about ready to build a Peter Zumthor designed new building for the permanent collection. You know, every building so far, new building has been for modern or contemporary art, so this is the first to hold our historic collections. And the idea is not to have the American wing, the European wing, but to do collaborative thematic shows that may be up for a year or 2 or 3, but then would maybe go on to travel, and you do a different, you know, like it's almost like a special exhibition space, except you're using your permanent collection. So it animates, because we found that when that 1965 building was installed, and 50 years later, people come, and when we were taking them around, they said, well, I've never seen this, because they go to New York or Europe to see art, but they don't come back to see your own hometown permanent collection sometime. So I think it's all about trying to animate and bring new audiences in.
Reminded me rather of going back into a studio to experiment. So you have like an experimental space, which you said animates, and that kind of provides a different dialogue between different people and artifacts. And so we go into another circle, which goes back into a different kind of experimental production of what you then show. So that was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you see it in Reiko's show here. You know, it's about producing and getting people to understand what goes into a textile. And that's how I look, you know, maybe because I sewed my own clothes and whatever, but, you know, I'm interested in my thematic sections all are about making. It's the silhouette, and then it's the textile and the tailoring and the trim, you know, so.
Can I add? I think also like when you make an exhibition, or me also as an artist, there's always so many things that you want to bring forward in an exhibition, and maybe in the end you can only show 10%. Especially if you start to think about the public just passing by, actually, not staying longer than 1 or 2 minutes at the most to looking at one item, for example. So you always have to make decisions. How are you going to communicate this object or this concept or this issue to the public? So yeah, I mean, it's limited with everything. So yeah, from there on, it's interesting, especially nowadays with this speedy society, that you have to think about how to bring it fast forward to the audience, you know, without and also considering that nowadays people have already so much knowledge, so you can start from in the hope that they have. So you can how you participate on people who don't know anything yet, and the people already have a lot of knowledge. So there's a lot of many decisions to make, and you lose a lot always, I'm sure, and we have to accept that.
Honestly spoken, I'm always bored to see how, if I see batik exhibition, it is always boring. Because, you know, okay, I know that, and it is hanging there, one textile and the other one hanging there, and with description, and so, okay. So, but then for the permanent exhibition, we made an experiment. So we make an installation of the whole 26 batik, and I had to find a storyline, what I said, yeah. So the storyline is only for people to catch them, to catch their interest, to see the installation. But of course, I had many bad critics from the specialists, because they say, I cannot see there, it is so too high, and I cannot see there, it is too low, and it is so. Yeah, you have to make your decisions. Do you want to have the common people to come to your museum and to love batiks, or it is only for the specialists, or so? It is always 10% for that and 10% for this, and so, yeah.
Yeah, when I think about designing an exhibition, I do it so that if somebody comes in who's never been in the museum before and they walk around, they should enjoy themselves.
Yes.
And then for people who are interested, you have your label. And then for your colleagues, because we're always concerned about scholarship, you have the catalog, you know.
So true.
Yeah, but then thinking about the outsider, I'm outsider of the textile world, so so that I'm also trying to make the exhibition which those who not having the textile knowledge, that can approach, right? And but after making this exhibition, actually I realized the methodology, making that these exhibitions actually following the methodology which the Reiko-san apply in making textile. So she is really open and to collaborate with the non-textile expert. Yeah. So yeah, so and yeah, invite the like washi paper craftsmen. Yeah, and also you don't afraid talking with the politician to get the fund to invent the new machines for making the silk yarn, right? So we actually did the same to make the exhibitions. That is actually interweaving the different the peoples, and yeah, that's I enjoy that. Yeah.
I kind of forgot what was the original question, but but something came crossing my mind. I'm not a textile connoisseur myself. I can only speak of the territory that I belong to, which is contemporary art. And I think contemporary art has witnessed this kind of active and rapid destabilizing of exhibitionary canon, and this kind of active invitation of foreign experiences onto that territory is true not only in the practice of many, many artists. A good example would be Pierre Huyghe, who constantly replaces exhibition with I don't know, a journey, a script, a radio, like a fictional thing, an opera, but also in curatorial practice. And the recent winning curatorial projects of the Venice Biennial testifies to it. The Sun and Sea of the Lithuanian Pavilion, and the previous one of Anne Imhoff, right? I think this trend is connected to the renewed understanding of how knowledge is now produced and distributed. I think nowadays knowledge production and distribution is not delinked from senses, bodies, and beliefs. So these, what I'm trying to say here, for example, when Clementine Delis was directing Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt, she opened the storage of ethnographic objects, letting people without expertise come and interact with them. You could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could be a homemaker, anyone. You would come and interact with object, and in so doing, you would emanate your own personal ideas about it, and like it will generate your own personal synergies between the object and the museum. So yeah, I think senses, bodies, and beliefs is what is right now being dealt with. Sorry if it's a bit esoteric.
No, I mean, I think what I conclude from this, the answer to this question is that it really does take a village, so to speak, of ideas and of people and of disciplines and of senses and bodies to create textiles, especially textiles in the contemporary day. And I like how also it links very strongly back to CHAT's manifesto. I am on the advisory board, so weaving creative experiences for all, which really sort of encapsulates how the institution tries to bring people from all disciplines together in the creation of their work. Now, I want to open the floor to perhaps one more question somewhere. Anyone at all? No? If not, I've got more questions that were on the board. And this is a very appropriate question. I can't get away without asking this question. Sustainability. Sustainability and the future of textiles. Your thoughts on this?
That's a Reiko question.
There is no answer written on his face.
Talk about scraps. Talk about scraps. Sustainability.
Oh, scraps, ne? Well, there is the exhibition titled Scraps, started 2016 in New York, Cooper Hewitt Museum. And the curator told me, rubbish of the textile industry is the second amount of done. Yes, so like first one was like
oil. The first.
That's right. Yeah, oil. But the second one was the fashion, textile, and that was shock to hear. And also, there's a big issue right now. all the leftover clothes or used clothes are not sent to somewhere. It's really, really difficult because until 2018, China received everything from America, Japan, and Europe, and everywhere. But all of a sudden, they said no more rubbish. And yes, and Philippines, Indonesia, and other country is having a problem right now. But I think, as I always said, it's good for the consumer, getting a very cheap clothes and very high quality and very high design. But we should really, really think what's going on in the future. And I've been working for Muji since 2007. And the first project I did, you had to make organic cotton because we are small and we are using organic cotton since 1983, but it's nothing, no meaning. But somebody like you to use organic cotton, and farmer will finding out. And they said, okay, we could do it. And then they did it. And 100%, 2015, they targeted, they dominated. And 2013, I did the Hook project, which is the like a recycling and also the older used clothes will becoming ethanol. So everything they receive, they could make ethanol out of the. So I think consumer has to understand. Each of them has to return the clothes to the merchant or like a shop or maker. Then we will do something. Because there are so many, like a chemical recycling system in Japan, and also it's a nice way of recycling wool in Japan and Prato in Italy. I think we could send everything to Italy and Japan if your garment are made out of 100% wool. And they can make a new wool out of the only 2 countries right now. But I think we could do it. And all the oil, like cotton oil industry, have to send all the like seed hair to Japan, Miyazaki. And they could make Bemberg, Cupra. So they are announcing. So we have to just keep telling. And I think each of our like a user, have to think. It's a simple thing. Please return your clothes to your like a shop, not to the, yeah. Trash, yeah.
I would just like to add something that we constantly hear a lot of things about consuming ecologically, but we rarely hear about actually producing ecologically, because there is so much there's so many messages from, I don't know, corporations and companies producing stuff that you can return this, or you could do, I don't know, swapping parties to secondhand. But it's all about consuming ecologically rather than actually making those people who produce ecologically.
Well, I think since I did this exhibition, my perspective toward the textiles actually shifted in a good way, because the textiles everywhere, like as you know, the first question, like were we born with a textile? Maybe like that's gonna be the first one or second one after your mom touching you. The fabric or textile is gonna be touching you. But I didn't have any clue like where it come from, and I didn't really check my tag, like what kind of materials I've been using. Yeah, I know it's about habitat, but I think that most of the consumer been doing the same thing. Now I do understand like where it's come from, how it's composed. It's either the chemical or natural, and then I think it have to be like we have to prevail or we have to educate the consumer, which is maybe the audience of the museum. Everybody visiting the museum will learn about where it come from or like how we can contribute. And so that might be, well, so that's why like I've been really interested in like what's the role of a museum right now. Well, of course, it's archiving is really good. I mean, like the main law. And then also maybe the second law might be archiving, like how the craftsman be doing. Well, because there's so many, like for example, Japan, there's so many craft museum like running by the government, which has maybe like 5, maybe 10 people in a day. Nobody been understanding, or nobody been really interested in like going there. So it have to be like, of course, it have to be fun. And then it have to be variable. It have to be like open to the public. Otherwise, like as Leiko-san say, it's simple, but the bar not gonna be like go lower. That's what I thought.
I also think it's the duty of the designers to, in the way they select their materials, and more of them are speaking out, and more of them are trying to use organic or recycled or. So I think the message is out there, and I think it has to be from all of us, the maker, the designers, and historians or keepers of these materials. But I do, Japan has been very kind of on the forefront quietly, in terms of cleaning water, or I think Issei did that years ago, or making polyester out of PET bottles. You've got a lot of very innovative textile industry that has been addressing this for a long time.
All right, so we have just a few minutes left, so I want to go back to this theme of textile as concept, and perhaps end the day with asking each of the speaker to just say what comes to mind immediately when I say the word textile.
Textile is an abstract energy, as has been pointed out. It is a paddling cloth and a funerary cloth at the same time, right? It's like an absolutely abstract energy.
I think textiles is a base fabric whereby, depending on its meaning, is given to it by the person who comes into contact with it. So in terms of museological terms, so it has that different meaning, whether the person who made the original fabric and then the person who goes on to use the fabric. So I think it, in a way, therefore, my understanding of textile, it's definitely in terms of a museum point of view that it doesn't have a static or fixed meaning. It really is a fluid fabric for you to weave your meaning into it.
My first thought was warp and weft, but then when we look at bark cloth, that has nothing to do with warp and weft. So maybe I would say it's a blank canvas, that cultures have made or decorated it. We add our own memories and impressions. And I hope that, too, what we didn't talk about was, I'm not sure how the current generation, when they're shopping online so much, how they can even do that, because you can't touch the fabric. That's the first thing. I remember last night, or this morning, I took Edith's scarf, and I said, well, this is the textile handshake, is feeling the textile.
Yeah, when I think about textile, I think about that is such a wide medium to discuss all kinds of different issues. So I think this is for me the love part of textile.
Textile is for me like the second skin. It's belong to me, it's belong to my life, and yeah.
Textile for me is well, basically a big challenge, and I have to tackle all the time, but as long as I'm working here. But at the same time, some textile offer me the very rich questions. Then that's something related to my everyday life, but also philosophical questions and also artistic questions, which I enjoy to work with.
かっこいいね。Well, textile. This is not my saying, but one of my favorite art critics said, textiles like a water, he said. Textile, 水のようだ. How do you say?
Like water.
Like water. Because water will change when the water get into the container. So any kind of shape, the textile will be become a shape.
That's going to be the answer of today. But from my point of view, textile is a media. So I really want to utilize textile as a media. And then also I have to promise that like documenting the process of a textile going to be my lifelong project. Yep.
Wow. All right, a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you so very much to all of you. There were more questions on the board, but they were directed to specific speakers, so I welcome you to approach them when we're done with this panel. And in case you hadn't noticed, we are done, so class is dismissed. I'm going to hand it back to Bruce Lee.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kenny, and thank you for all the speakers today for the wonderful conversations that we just had. Particularly, I was very touched by all the intimacies with textiles that was revealed and all the personal stories. Thank you, Kenny, for bringing that to the fore. Thanks very much. Another round of applause, maybe. Thank you.